Moving on to now the issue of freedom of religion and belief. Desi, could you just move on to the next slide? Now, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to give some current realities with regards to religious groups. Many of this you can see this group as they confront this issue of COVID-19. And as we go along with this, looking at some of these current realities, I also will highlight some points of tension and dynamics for consideration that will pose problems for MPs. And then what I will do is that we will look a little bit into what the whole idea of freedom of religion is about, and what are some instances or some criteria or principles whereby religious freedom may be restricted. And we will end the presentation there and then have a discussion. Now, as you know, in some current realities with religious groups, there are some religious groups who actually say, or representative of religious group who says that in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, what's important is that we should fear God more than fear the disease. The disease is a man-made manifestation. We should have fear of God rather than what is actually man-made. So implicitly, it also means that our allegiance, our loyalty should be fear in God. And anything that to do with religion, we must honor God. So that's one argument in favor of what you call the practice of gathering, the practice of religion during the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, also associated with the first understanding is this. There are some others who actually say that God is with us, so we must honor him. When they say God is with us, they also mean that they also imply that when we are faced with the pandemic, God will protect us. God is divine. He is God. He is divine. He is above the diseases. He is above any man-made situation. And so we must trust in him. We must trust in God. And what must our response be? Our response must be continuously to honor him, irrespective of whatever ban or whatever prohibition that government may place upon the group. So this is another understanding or another narrative that comes about. Well, a third kind of more popular understanding and narrative that is actually going around right now is that they regard religious gatherings, worship services as essential services. So during this time of a crisis of pandemic, essential services is important. So they have classified religious gathering as essential services, and therefore any ban on religious gathering is not acceptable. So these are some of the current understanding and realities going around. Next slide. Desi, next slide. Now this presents a little bit of dilemma for law and policy makers. Firstly, it begs the question, of ourselves, our fellow human beings, or our religious freedom as a right. It also begs the question that religion or faith or spirituality does play an important role during this time, and it is a good source of motivation, good source of comfort for crisis management during this time of pandemic. So we must not reduce the role of religions or reduce or limit the influence of religion during this time of pandemic. So religion is an important factor. Therefore, limiting or restricting religion should be done sparingly, as little as possible. So that's one argument, that's one dilemma. Of course, there's also this dilemma that's being played around not only in Southeast Asia region, but all over the world. The question of priority of human measures over divine intervention. Religious adherents, believers, believe in divine intervention, so there's no question about it. From medical professionals are important. So which takes priority over which? Divine intervention or the priority of human measures? Now, all these situation plays and creates a dilemma for law and policy makers. How then, what kind of policy should we put in place? How should we implement the laws or policies as far as religious freedom is concerned with respect to religious groups? So to be able to resolve this dilemma, it's important then to now understand a little bit about what religious freedom is about. And so for the next slide, Desi, next slide. Okay, I'll take it one by one. Firstly, just one by one. Firstly, to understand, this is in the form of a chart, and it answers the question, what is religious freedom about? Firstly, we have, as far as religious freedom is concerned, point of view, you are legislators, you are parliamentarians, you are familiar with the law, the international standards. But I'm looking now at more the point of view of from the sociology of religion point of view. So understanding religious freedom from a sociology of religion or a social dynamics point of view will help us understand how we can address this issue of whether we can limit or restrict religious freedom. Firstly, what is religious freedom? Of course, as far as religion is concerned, there's this issue of the ultimate reality. It may be God, it may be Allah, or it may be any other thing, but usually it is a transcendent force or reality that is above we human beings. Then there is also that adherence. Next. Now, as far as the adherence is concerned in relationship to the ultimate reality, the adherents try to find a purpose with the ultimate reality. He or she then begins to order his or her life in relation to that ultimate reality. Next slide. Just press on it. As a person orders, he or she orders his life against the ultimate reality, he also forms or he or she forms a relationship with the other, the neighbor. So in the process of forming that relationship with the other, we now look at it from the point of view of the interests of the other. So we consider the welfare and well-being of our neighbors. Some religion have it as we love our neighbors. And then as we love our neighbors or we consider the welfare and well-being of our neighbors, we look at the other from a point of view of humanity. They are all part and parcel of humanity. And as part and parcel of humanity, as we live to consider the others and looking at others as part and parcel of the humanity, we want to other. There's another slide. Yes, peaceful coexistence. And central to this whole idea of purpose, relationship, humanity, ordering of one life, considering the neighbor and having a peaceful coexistence is the idea of human dignity, the centrality of human dignity. So this forms the basis of freedom of religion. So freedom of religion is not just me and my God or me and my ultimate reality. It is also me and my consideration and love for the well-being of our neighbors as part of humanity, living in peaceful coexistence with the other. That's what religious freedom is about. And we cannot reduce one of these three or any of these three elements. Otherwise, that will not be a holistic conception of freedom of religion. That means that freedom of religion is central and absolute to human progress. Yes, and the right to freedom of religion is inalienable and non-derogable. That means it is central. Now, if you look at this chart or this graphic explanation of what religious freedom is about, then it will be easier to understand the question, can we restrict or limit religious freedom even during the time of pandemic? Next slide. Next. Now, which means that religious freedom may be restricted in one or two ways, not so fast. Yes, that's correct. Religious freedom may be restricted in one or two ways. Internally, from the point of view of the religious community themselves, the religious community may restrict certain beliefs, certain practices as far as the religion is concerned. Now, would this be called restrictions, or would it be called externally? It can also be restricted. So as far as externally is concerned, it may be restricted in the point of view of decree, the statute, policy, convention, and practices. So when we are talking about the restriction to religious freedom, we are actually talking from the external point of view. That means external bodies, external entities, state apparatus, structures, institutions that are issuing restrictions to religious freedom. That's what we are talking about. Question here is, what is restricted? The ICCPR, the Human Rights Declaration, uses the word manifestation. Some constitutional provision uses the word profession. But I would say that essentially, when we talk about restriction to religious freedom, we are talking about the ordering of our life in relation to others according to what a particular religion live our life according to others, according to the religion, in relation to others, or the well-being, the welfare of others. So that's basically what is essentially restricted. So it can be with respect to practices, it can be with respect to certain profession of the faith. A question that is interesting to ask at this point is, what about communities who self-censor themselves? That means they restrict their own practices because of issues like fear, pressure, uh, and the tensions that come, peer tensions that come from other communities. So they then begin to self-restrict themselves. Would this be considered restriction to religious freedom? Something that we can talk about afterwards. Next slide. Okay. For restricting religious freedom. Firstly, of course, the ICCPR Article 18 uses words like public safety, order, health, moral, and the rights of others and all. Well, that's fine. I will go further. I will say that, well, restriction to religious freedom cannot be discriminatory and cannot be arbitrary. I've set out what you call the grounds there for us, summarize the grounds there for us. It means when I say it cannot be discriminatory and arbitrary, it cannot target a minority group. For example, you can't target just within the boundaries of the state, say just the Muslim minority or Christian minority, which is happening at some parts in India, for example. You cannot also just be confined to the benefit of one community. You cannot just say, well, this restriction is only applicable to the region of Kashmir, where all other parts of the country, there is no restriction. Region or community. Next, next, Desi. Yes, it has to be. It has to be definite. The restriction or the decree towards the restriction has to be definite, and it cannot be permanent. Because why is it? Why it can't be permanent? Because religious freedom is an absolute right. It can only be restricted based on certain principal considerations. So it has to be definite and non-permanent. What do I mean by that? When a restriction towards religious freedom is actually decreed, there must be a length of time. You can't say indefinitely. It cannot go on perpetually. The restriction also must be spelled out as to what it is about. What are you trying to restrict? Are you trying to restrict gathering? Are you trying to restrict what you call services? Or are you trying to restrict prayer activities? Are you trying to restrict fellowship meals and get together and so on and so forth. Here in Malaysia, some groups will say, why is it that the government is restricting us during the month of Ramadan when we have to practice our religious obligation? That's not true, because as far as Ramadan is concerned and the religious obligation of fasting of puasa, no government or anyone can restrict your exercise of fasting. You may not be able to go out of your home, but you can certainly fast at your home. You can certainly observe the fasting restriction, the fasting disciplines from, say, sunrise all the way to sunset. And then after that, go about your breaking fast. Now, the restriction is not with regards to the fasting. The restriction can happen with regards to, say, at the time of breaking fast, what do you do? In the past, practices have been, we go to the Ramadan bazaar, buy plenty of food, or we go to this eatery, the hotels, and share our meal together with our family, friends, and community. Restriction is with regards to the gathering, so, but not to the fasting. So this is just an example of what I mean by it has to be definite and non-permanent. In terms of the restriction, if the restriction is put in place, you have to specify what are the violations is all about and what is the penalty if there is a violation. It cannot be something that is so vague that state or authorities may take advantage of that situation. And lastly, this also begs a very interesting question. The restriction is actually on grounds for religion. What about the cults, or what about the cultic practices? Does that apply to this consideration or this principal consideration for restriction with respect to religion? Does cult fall into that? Or we can make an exemption for cult and cultic practices. As far as cults or cultic practices is concerned, we can just simply say, let's prohibit them, let's ban them altogether. Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism, yeah, we exercise some form of restriction. That's a question that we can discuss. And of course, lastly, before any restriction is to be applied, consultation is important. Wider consultation is important. So deliberation and consensus, we need to seek the deliberation and consensus of religious leaders, religious group. If we can't have a total consensus, at least some kind of majority. And when we seek the consensus, it has to be proportional to the aim of the restriction. The restriction cannot be made in such a way, consensus cannot be obtained in such a way that it does not commensurate with the aim of the restriction. So these are some principal grounds for consideration when we talk about restriction to religious freedom. But coming back to summarize, coming back to what religious freedom is about, religious freedom is basically about ordering of one life in relation to the other as part of humanity for peaceful coexistence. Part and parcel of the process of ensuring a good life in consideration of your neighbors in some form of peaceful coexistence. So the restrictions are not restrictions per se, but they are part and parcel of ensuring that the well-being of others and yourself and peaceful coexistence are met. So that's it for my very brief presentation. Time for some discussion and some Q&A. Thank you very much.